Today I'm going to make a Necron Tomb Sentinel stroke Tomb Stalker. It's going to be magnetised. I'm not going to use any green stuff, and it's coming right up.
Necrons!
Nick speaking, and welcome to this video. Right, here we go. I'm going to make a plastic Tomb Sentinel stroke Tomb Stalker from 3 Wraiths. I can't wait to do this conversion. I've been waiting for years to do it, and halfway doing this conversion, Games Workshop puts the unit into Legends. However, I don't care. I've had a lot of fun building this miniature, and I can't wait to play it because I don't play in tournaments. I can't wait to play this miniature as well. Right, first of all, of course, I worked on the base. You can see me doing my scenic base whilst we have a quick chat about this conversion. If you want to know more about this base, then there is a link to a video that I made in the description below for you. Okay, so here we go. So we have the Tomb Stalker and the Tomb Sentinel. They are resin kits previously available from Forge World. Expensive kits. And also with resin, they tend to be quite, well, let's say delicate. I have found that with my Forge World Acanthrites, they can snap quite easily. So making this kit out of plastic not only is going to make it a little bit more durable, but also a lot cheaper. I'm going to use 3 Wraith kits and a couple of little bits which I got from my bits box for this conversion. Now I'm sure you've probably already seen the Super Wargamer video about making one of these out of 3 Wraiths. His video is great, and I'll be honest, I used it as a guideline for my conversion. However, I do believe that I have improved on the conversion. I have no green stuff of filling gaps and stuff with this conversion, and I've magnetised it so I can have it as both miniatures. So yeah, here we go. Let's get this conversion underway. Now, one thing I do want to say with this conversion video, especially if you're following along, is I would recommend you watch the whole thing before you do any work yourself, because I do adapt some of the work as I go along. You'll see it in the video, but basically I'll do something and then later in the video I will change how I did it, just because I made some improvements as I went along. Okay, so with that said, let's get straight into the conversion. Okay, so I started off by printing out some pictures of the original miniatures, just so that I could get an idea of what it looks like, and also the difference between the Sentinel and the Stalker. There isn't too much difference. The Sentinel has something extra on its back. It of course has a gun front, a gun head, and the other one has a normal head with 2 Gauss flares on it. The back of the miniatures are very similar. They look almost the same, but one's got claws and one hasn't. I'm going to just keep the back of my miniature the same for both miniatures. My plan is just to magnetise the front to determine which is which. So I started off by clipping off all of the carapace sections, the top and the bottoms. I just clipped them off and then I cleaned all the mould lines off. Once that was done, I just put the top of the carapaces aside and I glued the bottom sections together just using normal plastic glue. Okay, so we've ended up with 3 small pieces, 3 medium and 3 large. The 3 small pieces will go at the back of the miniature, the medium ones of course in the middle, and the large ones at the front. I got my base and I worked out roughly where I would like this centipede to be. Now in my head originally I was going to have a really big curve at the back as it curved around the base. However, as I discover later in the conversion, such a big curve isn't actually possible. It's certainly not very easily possible. So I end up with a curve, but a lesser of a curve. My idea was to have the centipede going up the monolith, but with the front of the section not actually touching the monolith itself. It's going to be in the air. So I started with the back section. Now the end piece looks quite good to be the tail, so no work to do there at this stage, although I do add something on there later. And then I got the next piece and worked out roughly the angle that I wanted it to be. So I started by cutting the angle that I wanted. and I did this using my blue tack trick. So a piece of blue tack on a paint pot, then you put your piece that you want to cut onto the blue tack, and then get your knife, you put it into position, and you sort of wiggle the knife backwards and forwards just with a little bit of pressure, and you'll gradually cut through the plastic, and then it will go through onto the blue tack with no damage and no pinging bits everywhere. I then cleaned it up, and then I got to the next piece and did exactly the same. I used some blue tack to check how it was looking before I glued anything. So with the first 3 sections blue tacked together, it was time to do the next 3 sections. Now I am making sure that the underside of this miniature is all in line and looks quite nice. The top side doesn't really matter because we're going to put the carapace on top of it. Again, I'm working out the rough positions before I make any cuts. I just gradually cut away until I got a position and a fit that I liked. I do this for the next 3 pieces again and just use blue tack at this stage to hold them together. So the back 6 pieces are done, all cut into the positions that I like, and now it's time to glue them together. Again, I just use plastic glue for this job. So they've glued and are almost dry now. So now onto the front 3 sections. Again, working out the position and angles first, and then cutting with my blue tack trick. This trick really does make cutting a lot easier, and whilst you could use things like a Dremel, which I don't have, I found that cutting this way was pretty easy and I didn't have any issues. We are then going to move on to the front of that section, ready for the next piece to go on. Just work out the angle that you want and cut it so that you end up with a nice flat joining section. All you have to do then is get the next section and cut the back of it so that it fits into the position you want. Again, using blue tack for these 3 pieces, you work out the position for the next piece and you just keep repeating the process until all 3 are done. Obviously we're not going to cut anything from the front piece because that's where their head is going to go. Okay, so now we're ready to glue them together. Just put some plastic glue on there, hold it into position and let it dry. Okay, so on to the top carapace. We have 3 big ones and 3 small ones. Again, I'm following Super Wargamer's video here. He takes one of the big sections away. One big section goes at the front, then he puts the second big one next. However, my pose is a bit different from his, and the second one extends onto my next section, so it's basically just too big. I looked at cutting the piece to maybe try and join them, but in the end I decided to not use the second big piece, and I removed it totally. This does mean that my towel doesn't have a piece because I'm a bit short on pieces. The glue isn't totally dried here, so I decided to rotate the last 2 sections. I took it off and re-glued it the other way round. Of course, this meant the bend was the wrong way round as well, so I had to recut it again before I glued. Okay, back to the top section, and I had to go back to the drawing board because the small section I thought of using was just bending the wrong way, so I had a massive gap. In the end, I decided to use the big section, but I cut it in half. Now bear in mind that Super Wargamer has each section go underneath the first section, so they are overlapping. This does give you huge gaps which you will need to fill with green stuff. I'm aware of this at this stage, and in my head that's what I'm going to do. However, that does change. So I just adapt this second section, just make some cuts here and there until I think it fits nicely into that next piece. Once the overlapping is done, then I clean it up with my knife and my file to make it look as good as I can once it's overlapped by the first piece. Again, lots of dry fitting here. In the end, I decide to remove all of the old little joining points to try to get these pieces as flat to the body as possible. I do this for each section as I'm doing them, but in the end I just removed them all. With the pieces removed, I reshaped the second piece a little more just to get it to fit as best as I could. Once done, I looked at the next section. I just removed the flat piece at the front again by dry fitting and using the overlap method. I then do the same for the next piece as well. Okay, so we are ready to glue. I used plastic glue so that I have time to adjust them as I'm putting them into place. And I'm really pleased that I did that because As I left it to dry, I kept thinking about the big gaps and how awkward it was going to be to fill them and also to make them look good. The top 3 sections were fine, as I'd already cut and reshaped the middle section to get a good fit. But the back 2 sections were where the issues were, so I came up with a new idea. So I took off the back 3 sections and I started cutting them. I cut the front section so that I could make it sit flush without it having to be overlapping. I left a little tab in it so that when it was joined together it matched the ones at the front. All I had to do then was glue them back on. Now you will see later in the video I do improve on the detailing work of this section, but at this stage I'm really happy as the carapace is almost flat on the body, not 100% flat, but enough where I don't have to use any green stuff. Okay, so that is all dry. Now I did look at the little flat sections on the side that I had. I know Super Wargamer beveled his with a Dremel. I don't have a Dremel, but I actually like them flat. I think it does match the front section of the miniature and it looks natural to me. Okay, so now it's time to work on the legs. I clipped off all of the claws from the 3 sprues and cleaned them up. Stop the press! Whilst clipping off the legs, I found this piece and I thought this would work really well on the tail section. I quickly ripped off the last tail section which hadn't quite glued yet and turned it the other way, the idea to use the flat section, because I really like the spine on the end of the tail pointing upwards. It just works better than when it was pointing down. And the idea is to use this piece on that flat section. I also found a little spine in my bits box which I was going to put in the centre of this piece. So I cut and glued them into position and we are done, and I think it looks a lot better. Now I do have this one odd flat piece underneath now, which obviously I did try to turn that piece over, but when I did, the glue had sort of melted all of the detail. It just wasn't worth it, so I just left it flat. It's not going to be a problem because when it's on its base, you're just not going to see the underside of the miniature, so it's going to be fine. Okay, so back to the legs. The front 3 holes will be for the head and the guns, etc. I really want to magnetise this miniature. I found the front of a destroyer gun which looks just about right. Then I found a little ball bearing to glue onto the front of the gun to make it into a little orb, just so that it looks like the original miniature. Then for the front 2 claws, I found some spare Scorpec destroyer legs from my Hexmark destroyer conversion that I did, where I used a wraith body as opposed to legs. So these were ideal for the front 2 pieces. First though, I went to the sprue and cut off the neck piece of the wraiths, 2 of them, 1 for each head, and then I cleaned them up. Okay, so the gun section is glued and I found a face for the other head. My plan was to magnetise the 2 heads at the neck section. So I drilled a 2mm hole into the neck piece and into the socket onto the body. I then glued in some magnets. These are 2 by 1mm magnets and N52 in strength. So now the neck section is magnetised. For the gun option, I was going to flatten it off at the bottom of the gun and then flatten the front section off and just glue that together. And then for the other head, I would have to reshape it a little bit to get the head to join onto the neck and make it look nice. Okay, so I went into my bits box and I found some Gauss flayers. I didn't have any of the old ones which have green rods, which was slightly disappointing, but these will do. So I cut off the back section where we had the arm. I also cut off the blade from the front and I just flattened it all down and made it look as good as I could. So I found these big sections here on the sprue and I cut them out and cleaned them up. These were going to be the arms for the guns and the claws. So I drilled out the 2 holes in the armpits and then I glued in a magnet. I glued the magnet in the reverse polarity to the head so that the arm and the head won't magnetise onto each other's socket. I then carefully drilled out holes into the arm joints, first using a knife to make a small hole and then my drill to finish it off. Then I glued in the magnets. So that was all done. All I had to do now was glue the guns onto the arm joints. there is a hole on the side of the gun, so I drilled that out with my 2mm drill and got them ready for gluing. Before that though, I cut out the blade on the Scorpec Destroyer leg. I removed the ball section that's on the blade, and then my plan was to glue it onto the arm joint, which I've just magnetised. Now, when it came to the guns, I realised very quickly that the guns are actually both the same way, of course. They're not the opposites, which is what I sort of for some reason thought they were. So when it came to working out how to glue them on, I realised the holes are both the same way, which wasn't great. So I had to come up with another plan. What I did is I cut the top section off and flattened it down, and then I drilled a hole out in the top section, so now the ball joint was going to be at the top of the gun. And then I covered the hole on the side of the gun. I just used the top of one of the little particle casters that were on the sprue. I just cut the top of the caster off, and then I just glued it over the hole. And whilst that side section is still on the same side on both guns, you don't really notice it, and it still works. Okay, so the guns are done, and I can change their position as needed. It's now back to the legs. We have 4 different sizes of legs in total. I'm going to keep 2 of the small ones back. They will go in the towel holes at the back, and they'll be angled like in the original miniature. We will start with the big claws, and for reference I have clipped off all of the join pins on all of the joints so that I can angle the legs in any position. I then glued all of the arms into the big claws and let them dry, and then I glued the first 2 big claws into position at the front. I then worked out where I was going to put the other big claws. I felt it was best to have them quite forward, so I used the next holes along for the second set. Then I left 2 holes for the third set. I did mess around a lot with this to get the best possible pose and positions that I could. I even used a mirror so that I could see the front and the back of the model to help me work out where to put these claws. Once I was happy with where I wanted them to go, I then glued them into position. Now there is a little hole tucked up inside that section which I'm going to sort out later. I then missed a hole before the third leg went on. When I tested the pose with the mirror, I came up with the idea that a small claw would work quite well in that hole. It would look really cool. So I just missed that hole and went to the next. Okay, so I'm backtracking or improving again. Those claws are done, but now I start to look at the back of the miniature. There are these 2 sort of flat sections here which start to make my eye look at them and think they are not right. There is a gap between that section and the next section, so I think I can cut them off without doing too much damage. I'm also thinking I can improve the look of the centre section as well. Maybe something like the Tomb Sentinel version of this miniature. I'm going to use this section again like I did on the towel, but this time I'm going to cut it into 2 pieces, and then for the middle section of those 2 pieces I'm going to use half of one of the little guns that's in there. Again, just chopping it around a little bit to make it fit as best I could. And here is the result. I think that this extra detailing has really helped the miniature. Now there is a hole in the top of the gun which I'm going to sort out later. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with it, but I'll cover up the hole at some point. Right, back to the legs. I spread them out on both sides and took away the ones that I would need for the front and the back section of the miniature. Then I had to work out where I would put the legs, because of course we have more holes than legs themselves. I also had to think about the best way to actually glue these into position on my base. In the end, I thought I would glue all the legs into position with plastic glue, then place it onto the terrain with some supporting blue tack. As plastic glue takes a while to dry, it would mean that I'll be able to adjust the legs before they actually dried. I used blue tack on some of the legs just to hold them into the position that I would like them to dry in. Then I let them dry. As it was drying, I took some pictures of it in its position. I was planning on gluing the legs to the monolith after painting. I just think it's going to be easier to paint these separate and then glue afterwards. Once it was dry, I then added the 2 small legs into the back section and the 2 bigger legs at the front to look like claws. Okay, so that is all dry, and then my eye was drawn to the 2 flat pieces at the joints of the carapace. I just didn't like them. So I got a little spine from my bits box and I cut out 2 pieces to fit into those little holes. The idea was to make them look like little hinges rather than spines. I just glued them into place using tweezers and job done. Much better, I think. I used a section from the spine piece and glued it into the tail hole as well. It just gave the tail a little bit more detail and also made it look more like the original miniature. I was loving these extra details I was doing. I think it really helps the conversion come together. Okay, back to filling in the leg holes. I cut off all of these pieces and cleaned them up. I then cut off the end to make a little ball, and I glued it into the really awkward holes that were at the side of the miniature, the ones which were sort of inside the body. I had 2 larger pieces left over after doing the magnetising arm work, so I cut off those larger orbs and I put them near the front. I thought that would be pretty cool to have orbs at the front section. Then I cut off all the small ones and glued them into the rest of the holes. At this stage I was looking to fill the hole on the back as well. I tried this section on the sprue, but it was way too big. I also cut off an orb to try and get a little orb to go in there, but it just didn't look quite right. So in the end I used another small ball bearing and that worked really well. Okay, so now it's time to do the antenna, which I'm going to use whip coils. Now I did consider using the towels like Super Wargamer does because, well, they're stronger, let's say. Whip coils, of course, are quite fragile. However, I liked the whip coil look better, and I'm pretty careful with my miniatures, so I was hoping that it wouldn't be a problem. However, I did actually come up with an idea to try and make these whip coils stronger, and it definitely worked well. I had the idea to strengthen them by joining 2 whip coils together. I experimented with the extra spare set that was left over. I cut the side sections off so that I could glue them together and they would be flush. Now I only did this because I knew I had extra whip coils in my bits box, so I was able to do 4 of these, so I needed 8 whip coils altogether to do this. If you don't have extra whip coils, then of course you can't do this. You may want to use the Wraith towels instead. But I personally think whip coils just look so much better and they look a lot more like the original. So I glued them together and let them dry. I then cut the base of the antenna at an angle and glued them onto the head. I then did exactly the same for the head with the gun. I then put some PVA glue on the base and covered it in sand, and I was done. The heads were dry. I put my head onto the model and thought to myself, that head looks really small now that I put those antennae on. And I really wasn't happy with that head. The gun head I liked. I thought that worked quite well. But the other head, I didn't like it at all. So I went back to the drawing board with that head and I started again. I attempted to do Super Wargamer's idea of using 4 Wraith heads joined together. But I didn't really like it. I didn't like the fact that they didn't fit together very well. So I sort of abandoned that idea. I had a look in my bits box and I found this Praetorian back torso piece. And wow, it looked almost perfect as a head. I cut off the 3 orbs at the back so that I could fit the magnetised arms into position when the head was on. And I cleaned up the pieces that I cut off and reshaped them a little so they weren't flat. I then got the spare neck piece and put a magnet in it, and then I cut it off to fit the back of the new head. I glued it into position, and then I used the orbs that I cut off the torso section and I glued them into the armpit joints of the side of the body just to hide those joins. I also cut off one of the mandibles that was on the original head, and then I glued that into the mouthpiece just for some more extra detail. And then finally I put the end of a little spine on the flat section of the back of the head for some detail, and then I cut off the antenna from the other head and glued them onto the side sections of the new head. And this new head is so much better. However, when I recorded the showcase clip, for some reason I magnetised on the claws and not the guns, and I've primed the miniature black now, so I can't re-record it. But I really had a lot of fun with this miniature. It was enjoyable, it was a challenge, especially first time building it, but hopefully some of my tips along the way will serve you well if you plan to do your own conversion. I personally think that I have improved on Super Wargamers 1, but of course using his video as a base to this conversion, I'm also going to link up his video for you in the description below. I'd recommend you watch both of them before you go ahead and do your own conversion. If you would like to support the channel, then you can do so by memberships. I have 3 membership levels, 99p for a warrior, $3.99 for a cryptek, and $8.99 for a overlord. Check the join button below to find out more. In the meantime, if you want to see more Necron conversions, here's a playlist featuring some of my other videos.